The massive convoy pushed through the tight Korangal Valley like a steel river forced into a crack in the mountain. Dozens of armored carriers and support trucks hauling 620 Navy SEALs, pallets of gear, and enough firepower to flatten half the province. Dawn had just slipped over the eastern ridge, washing the jagged rocks in burnt gold and dusty red. The kind of beautiful morning that usually meant nothing dangerous was coming. But anyone who'd spent enough time in Kunar knew calm moments were the ones that flipped into nightmares without warning. In the lead MATV, Chief Nolan Pierce leaned forward behind polarized lenses, studying the slopes with the instinct of a man who'd survived more ambush zones than he cared to count. 20-plus years of running special operations had carved a second sense into him. And right now, every nerve he owned was ringing like an alarm. Sheer cliffs crowded both sides of the pass, the sort of terrain that practically invited an enemy to sit above you and let gravity do half their work. "I don't like this," he muttered into the radio, barely moving his jaw. "Too damn quiet." 2 vehicles back. Petty Officer First Class Tessa Calder tightened the straps on her plate carrier and checked her customized rifle yet again, unable to shake the prickling tension crawling up her spine. At 29, younger than most operators in the column, she'd earned her place through a streak of hard-won combat experience that stretched across continents. Her dark hair was pulled into a no-nonsense tactical bun, sharp eyes flicking over everything, as steady and analytical as always. Officially, she was an intelligence specialist, someone meant to sit in chilled rooms sorting satellite feeds and assembling target decks. But the moment she heard the route cut through contested ground and that the roster was 1 shooter short, she put her name in without a second thought. "Relax, Pierce," came Lieutenant CMDR Adrian Locke's voice over the net. "Intel says this sector hasn't had activity in weeks. We'll be out of the valley in 20 minutes. Tessa's brow tightened. Anytime someone said an area was quiet, it usually meant the intel hadn't been updated since last payday. She shifted the rifle between her knees, the long-barreled, hand-tuned weapon she'd built over years of trial and error, its trigger polished to perfection and optic worth more than her entire car. At 0847, the illusion of safety shattered. The first RPG slammed into the 32nd vehicle, one of the heavy transports, detonating in a violent plume of black smoke and rolling flame that kicked the machine sideways like it weighed nothing. The concussion blasted through the line, shaking armor, rattling teeth, and stealing the air from lungs. Before anyone could even form a curse, the valley erupted in gunfire. Hundreds of rounds per minute poured from both ridges, precise bursts stitched into the column with ruthless coordination. "Contact! Multiple angles!" Pierce's voice cut through the chaos as he fired back from the window. "We're in a kill box!" Tessa was already moving, instincts overriding every other thought. She shoved the door open, dropped hard behind the engine block, and pressed into the hardened metal as bullets sparked off the hood and punched spiderweb fractures through the armored glass. Her rifle snapped into place, scope rising to her eye, and before her mind could catch up, she was already hunting shapes among the rocks. Enemy fighters were dug into the high ridges on both sides of the valley. Not just a scattered handful, but several hundred gunmen spread across layered firing points, all waiting for the exact second the massive column of 620 SEALs hit the narrowest choke. They'd planned it with discipline, patient, methodical, the kind of ambush you only see from people who understand terrain like it's a weapon. The return fire from the convoy shook the valley, but with so many shooters forced into a tight funnel, most rounds were just suppressing fire, not stopping the threat. Bullets tore across the bottleneck, ricocheting off stone, forcing heads down while the enemy held every height advantage imaginable. "We need movement," Lieutenant Sumdir Adrian Locke barked over the radio, frustration cutting through the static. "Forward or back doesn't matter, but sitting here gets us killed. Both routes are locked down." Chief Nolan Pierce fired a burst toward a flashing muzzle hidden among the rocks. "We step out from behind armor. We get shredded." That was when Tessa Calder caught it. A faint seam in the enemy's overlapping kill zones. A small blind spot carved naturally into the terrain. If someone could reach that ridge and hit the firing nests from the flank, the pressure on the convoy might finally break. The problem? It was nearly 300 meters of uphill open ground, under fire intense enough to skin a rock. For most people, it was suicide, but Tessa Calder had never lived by the word most. "I'm moving," she said into her mic, not waiting for anyone to tell her she was out of her mind. "Give me cover." She didn't pause for permission. Her body was already lowering into a combat crouch, rifle slung tight as she launched forward. The SEALs instantly caught on and poured a wall of suppressive fire toward the ridges, forcing enemy shooters to duck long enough for her to sprint. Rounds cracked past her helmet close enough to feel the punch of air pressure, and stone splinters exploded around her boots. Her world narrowed into a tunnel of noise, burning lungs and calculations firing faster than conscious thought. She slid behind a car-sized boulder just as a string of automatic fire stitched the dirt she'd crossed a half-second earlier. Her pulse hammered, but her hands remained impossibly steady, the steadiness she'd built over years of turning fear into fuel. A quick peek showed her next cover. A shallow dip about 20 meters ahead, reachable. Maybe. With enemy fire still suppressed by friendly volleys, Tessa exploded from behind the rock, running a jagged zigzag that made tracking her almost impossible. More rounds snapped past her, some close enough to heat the air. She dove into the depression like a runner sliding into home plate, rolled, and brought her rifle into position in one smooth motion. From here, she had clean angles on 3 firing nests. Settling into the dirt, she slowed her breathing, letting that strange stillness wash over her, the one that came every time a scope touched her cheek. First target. A fighter tucked behind sandbags roughly 250 meters out. She watched the flicker of his muzzle, tracked the small rise of his head as he adjusted. Her reticle rested on the exposed slice of forehead. One steady squeeze. Clean drop. Second target, a gunman darting along the ridge for a better angle on the convoy. She led the shot by instinct, compensating for distance and speed. Another squeeze, another body falling. The ambushers began to sense something was wrong. Precision fire was hitting them from an angle they didn't account for, and confusion rippled through their lines as some attempted to shift positions to locate the unseen sniper. But Tessa was already on her third target, a fighter wrestling a heavy machine gun into place, one that could chew through armored vehicles like they were soda cans. She couldn't let that weapon get up. The range now pushed close to 300 meters, wind tugging right to left. She adjusted a hair, let her breath settle, and prepared to fire. The wind kept nudging right to left, forcing Tessa Calder to flick her scope a hair to compensate before she squeezed off the round that dropped the heavy gunner across his own weapon. 3 targets gone in barely half a minute, and now the ambushers finally understood someone had slipped into their flank. A cluster of fighters redirected their fire toward her position, hurling a curtain of rounds that shredded the air above her head and chewed jagged holes into the rocky lip of the depression she was hiding in. She pressed herself flat, hearing Chief Nolan Pierce's voice crackle through the radio. Calder, status? Still breathing, she answered, oddly calm despite the metal storm ripping past. Their left flank's falling apart. Push forward and you'll get a window. Negative? We've got wounded. His voice vanished under the thunder of another explosion somewhere in the convoy's center. Tessa risked a glance and caught sight of thick smoke curling from the wreck of one of the transports, the entire situation tightening around them like a noose. If they didn't break contact soon, the 620 SEALs trapped in the kill box would be overwhelmed. She brought the scope back up, sorting targets by threat level, the ones handling heavier weapons, the ones directing movements, the ones adjusting angles to hit the remaining vehicles. Her rifle barked over and over, each shot surgical, each impact decisive. She wasn't spraying, wasn't gambling. She was cutting the spine out of the ambush one vertebra at a time. Her magazine clicked empty, and she swapped it out without ever lifting her eye from the glass, muscle memory turning her hands into independent tools. The enemy's once tight firing pattern was unraveling. Openings appeared where there had been none. Fighters were hesitating, shifting positions based on fear instead of orders, and fear made human beings predictable. "Pierce," she said into the mic, already rising to move. "I'm pushing higher. When you hear me firing again, drive that convoy forward as fast as you can. No stopping, no checking, just go." "Calder, hold your position. Trust me." She didn't wait for approval. She sprinted uphill while their suppressive fire stitched chaos along the ridges, her legs burning under 50 pounds of gear, sweat running into her eyes despite the cool mountain air. Stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant she failed all the people counting on her. She reached a jagged outcropping and dropped into prone, the entire kill zone spreading out beneath her like a grim map. From this vantage, she could see everything: the jammed convoy, the enemy fire lanes, the choke points the terrain forced everyone into. The moment she settled, her breath evened out and her heartbeat steadied, the roar of battle fading into a distant hum as she slipped into that razor-sharp shooting state where only the target existed. She worked methodically, eliminating the worst threats first: center mass shots for close fighters, precise headshots for those using cover, and perfectly timed leads for anyone moving along the ridge. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks as bodies dropped with uncanny regularity. They couldn't spot her, couldn't pin down the direction of the devastating fire. To them, she wasn't a sniper. She was a ghost ripping holes in their ambush. Some fighters tried to retreat, and she let them go. She wasn't there to inflate a kill count. She was there to get Americans out alive. Anyone still firing at the convoy, though, she erased without hesitation. Below, the remaining vehicles started grinding forward, engines roaring, gunners still hammering back. They were bleeding, but they were moving, and movement was survival. Tessa covered them relentlessly. RPG gunner, down. Machine gun team setting up a new position, gone. 2 fighters scrambling to block the exit path, both finished. Another magazine empty. Another reload done by instinct alone. 12 rounds left in this one. Maybe her last full mag before she'd be forced to ration. The convoy was seconds from clearing the kill box, but as they reached the final stretch, the enemy played their last card. A fighter suddenly rose from a hidden crevice directly in the convoy's path. RPG hoisted on his shoulder, the rocket already armed and seconds from ending one of the outbound vehicles with everyone inside. At that distance, he couldn't miss. Tessa Calder's scope locked onto him instantly, her crosshairs hovering over the tiny slice of head and shoulders peeking above the rock line. Nearly 400 meters. Far from easy, but she steadied her breathing, let half of it go, and froze the rest in her chest. Everything narrowed into a single pinpoint of focus as her finger eased tension onto the trigger. The rifle kicked. The fighter went limp as if a string had been cut, his RPG tumbling harmlessly to the dirt without ever firing. Below, the massive column of SEALs thundered past the kill zone's final choke point and spilled into the wider stretch of valley, finally out of immediate danger. Tessa stayed prone, sweeping the terrain for stragglers. Anyone left alive was already fading into the rocks, unwilling to keep fighting an unseen shooter who'd torn their ambush apart. The kill box was broken. The trap had failed, and the Americans were getting out. She pressed her radio. "Pierce, you're clear. I'm moving to rejoin." "Negative, Calder. Stay put. We're coming for you. Don't pull any hero crap. We've got wounded who need evac." "I can make my way down." "Not happening. Hold position. That's an order." The corners of her mouth tugged upward despite the fatigue dragging at her bones. SEALs always took care of their own, even when their own was an intel specialist who'd just saved several hundred operators from being wiped off the map. She checked the valley one more time, confirmed the danger had passed, then settled into a low crouch, reloading with hands as steady as if she were on a quiet range. 38 rounds left. Not ideal, but enough to discourage anyone suicidal enough to come searching. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp began to ebb, replaced with that crushing post-fight heaviness that made her limbs feel twice their weight. Her body reminded her she'd sprinted uphill through 300 meters of gunfire and then held a 20-minute shooting duel she shouldn't have survived. But she had. And so had hundreds of her teammates. Engines echoed from below. The convoy was returning, one of the armored transports peeling away and grinding up the ridge toward her. Tessa rose slowly, slung her rifle, and began moving down to meet them. The aftermath was brutal. The vehicle that reached her belonged to the second transport element, driven by Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Torres, who leaned out the window with dirt and dried blood streaking his face from a cut above his eyebrow. "You're either the bravest person I've met or completely out of your mind," he said, grinning through the exhaustion. "Maybe both." Tessa climbed into the passenger seat without fanfare. "Just doing my job." "Not like that you aren't." He put the truck in gear and eased it back down the ridge. 12 years on this job. Never seen shooting like yours. Nobody shoots like that." She didn't answer, just stared out at the landscape sliding past. Below lay the shredded ambush site. Equipment scattered, brass glittering in the sun, dark stains marking where the worst of the fighting hit hardest. Evidence that would wash off the rocks long before it left anyone's mind. A kilometer out, the reassembled convoy sat in a defensive perimeter. Medics worked over the wounded. Radios buzzed with higher command demanding updates, and the vehicle hit by the opening RPG still smoldered, a total loss. As Torres rolled into the line, Chief Nolan Pierce was already striding toward them, jaw tight, expression carved from stone. But something complicated flickered in his eyes. Gratitude, disbelief, and that look soldiers get when they've witnessed something they can't quite reconcile with reality. "Calder," he said as she stepped down from the truck. "We need a word." They moved just far enough from the others for privacy, but stayed close enough to remain under security. Pierce studied her for a long, silent moment before he finally spoke. "That might be the finest shooting I've witnessed in my entire career," Pierce said, without softening a syllable. And I've worked alongside some of the best marksmen in SOCOM. So tell me, how does an intel analyst outshoot every sniper I've trained? Tessa Calder had expected this conversation. Pulling off something extraordinary always brought questions that lived far above most people's clearance levels. I qualify with my rifle like everyone else, she answered evenly. Don't do that, Pierce snapped. Qualification is tapping targets at 200 meters on a calm range. What you did today was precision fire at long distance, under fire, with bad angles and moving targets. You don't learn that by punching a scorecard once a year. She held his stare, unblinking. Then maybe you should think about why someone with my skill set officially sits behind a screen. Pierce's eyes narrowed as understanding clicked. You're not just Navy. I'm whatever the Navy needs on any given day, she replied, voice flat, almost rehearsed. Petty Officer First Class, Intelligence Analysis. That's what my file says. That's who I am. He recognized the wall she'd just put up, the kind you didn't push on unless you wanted to lose your job or worse. Militaries had compartments inside compartments, jobs that didn't exist, programs hidden in shadows deeper than command wanted to acknowledge. If Tessa belonged to one of those units, digging would only cause damage. Right, he said quietly. Intel analysis. My mistake. No mistake, Chief. Just operational security. He nodded slowly. Well, you saved a hell of a lot of people today. I did my job. If your job is pulling SEAL teams out of an ambush, you're frighteningly good at it. Tessa allowed herself the faintest smile. I'll put that in my after-action notes. Proof the training works. Lieutenant Siamdar Adrian Locke joined them then, uniform torn and streaked with someone else's blood, his expression carrying the weight of fresh loss, but the composure of someone forcing himself to stay functional. Final numbers, he said, voice tight. 3 KIA, 7 wounded. Could have been far worse, Pierce replied, nodding toward Tessa. If Calder hadn't done what she did, we'd be looking at an entire battalion wiped out. Locke studied her like he was seeing her for the first time. I owe you an apology. When you volunteered, I figured you wanted a bullet point for your record. I was wrong. Nothing to apologize for, sir. You didn't know. I should have, he muttered. Your file hit my desk with more blacked-out lines than a CIA briefing. I assumed it was bureaucracy. Clearly it wasn't. Tessa offered no explanation. Sometimes silence was the only safe answer. Whatever you actually do when you're not analyzing intel, Locke said quietly. I hope someone up the chain realizes your value, because today was exceptional. Someone does, Tessa replied. That's enough. 20 minutes later, the medevac Blackhawks thundered in low, door gunners scanning the valleys. The wounded were loaded with clinical efficiency. The 3 who didn't survive were handled with solemn precision, bodies zipped into bags and carried with the kind of respect earned only on days like this. Tessa stood back watching the controlled chaos, knowing this part never made it into written reports. The cleanup, the triage, the quiet heartbreak. The faces of the injured, the weight of the dead, the knowledge that somewhere families would hear a knock tomorrow that would break them. Torres approached her as the helicopters lifted off, rotors slamming the air. Word is you dropped at least 15 fighters, he said. Maybe more. I didn't count. Shooters always count. She met his eyes. Then let's say I stopped counting once everyone had a chance to live. That's the only total that matters. He watched her for a long moment, as if trying to decode something hidden behind her steady expression. Who are you really? He finally asked. Tessa kept her face neutral. Petty Officer First Class Tessa Calder, Intelligence Analysis. Yeah, Torres snorted. The official line. I get it. He shook his head. But one day, when all that classified stuff finally sees daylight, I want the real version. She allowed a slight grin. If that day ever comes, I'll buy the first round and tell you everything. I'm holding you to that. An hour later, the convoy reformed. Short one vehicle with many empty seats and a mood weighed down by the heaviness that comes after barely escaping death. Everyone was still in mission mode, but the silence carried the reality of loss. Tessa slid back into the same vehicle she'd started in. Torres took the wheel, and Chief Nolan Pierce rode shotgun. They pushed out along an alternate route cleared by a quick reaction force the moment the ambush was reported. No one was gambling on the same road twice. As they rolled out, Pierce turned toward her. One more thing, he said. Go ahead. When you were sprinting between cover points back there, bullets were slicing that kill zone from every direction. How were you that calm? Tessa considered the answer. Because panic just gets you killed. Fear's information. It tells you where the danger is. Accept that, and you can think clearly enough to move through it. They don't teach that in boot camp. No, she agreed. They don't. So where'd you learn it? She gave him a flat look. Classified, Chief. He let out a humorless laugh. Figures. Everything about you is classified. Not everything, she said lightly. I take my coffee black. No clearance needed for that. Good, he muttered. We're finally sharing valuable intel. The convoy eventually reached the forward operating base without further contact. Passing through the gates brought a slow unwinding of the tension coiled inside her ribs. They hadn't all made it, but enough had. And in this line of work, sometimes that was the closest thing to a victory anyone got. Debriefing lasted nearly 3 hours. Tessa sat in a cramped room with Locke, Pierce, and 2 intelligence officers documenting every detail of the ambush, the enemy's setup, their tactics, and the convoy's response. She kept her answers precise, sticking strictly to what she observed. Ranges, wind shifts, ammunition use, angles, timing. She gave them the mechanics of shooting without touching the emotional weight of what shooting meant. The intel officers took notes without digging into her training or background. Either they already knew more than they could admit, or they'd been warned not to ask certain questions. For that, she was quietly grateful. When the session wrapped up, Locke stopped her at the door. One more thing, he said. Your actions today are going into my report, and I'm recommending you for commendation. That's not necessary, sir. It is, he insisted. Good work deserves recognition. My work is most effective when no one recognizes it. He gave a thin, tired smile. Then I'll make sure it's classified at the proper level. But it's going in. Calder, you earned it. She dipped her head, knowing that refusing further would be disrespectful. Thank you, sir. Outside, the sun was sinking over the base, throwing the sky into a blend of orange and purple. Tessa walked slowly toward her quarters, the weight of the day finally settling into her bones. Every muscle throbbed, her ears still rang from gunfire, and deep bruises were forming where her plate carrier caught impacts during her climb up the ridge. But she was alive. Hundreds of them were alive. And tomorrow, they'd do it all again. Her quarters were simple. A cot, a footlocker, a small desk, and a laptop wrapped behind layers of encryption. But right now, it looked like paradise. She leaned her rifle carefully against the wall, then settled on the edge of the cot, and began peeling off her gear piece by piece. The plate carrier came first, the ceramic plates inside still carrying scuffs from rounds she'd probably never even noticed. Then she unbuckled her battle belt, the pouches, the medical kit, all the little tools that separated life from death out there. Once she was down to her base uniform, she let her eyes close for a moment. Behind her eyelids, she could still see the kill box, could still feel the rifle kick into her shoulder, still sense the instant her crosshairs slid over each target and she made the choice to fire. Those images slid into the long, quiet archive of violence she carried, not something she wore with pride, and not something she regretted. Just a truth of the path she'd chosen. Someone had to stand in that space between chaos and the people who needed shielding. Today, that someone happened to be her. A knock pulled her out of the thoughts. "It's open," she said. Torres stepped in, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. He passed her one without commentary. She wrapped her fingers around it, breathing in the warmth. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Won't be sleeping anytime soon," he said, lowering himself onto the room's only chair. "Every time I blink, I see that RPG hit our truck, the blast, the fire. And I keep thinking, if we'd been half a minute slower, if you hadn't been there." "But I was there," she cut in gently. "And you weren't 30 seconds slower. What ifs don't help anyone." He stared into his cup like the answers were hiding in the coffee. "How do you do it? Go through something like that and then just sit here like it's normal?" "It's not normal," she said softly. "It's necessary. That's different." "So why volunteer for a run like this? You had to know it was a bad route." "Because someone needed to go," she answered. "And I had skills that could make a difference." Torres looked up. "You know what Pierce is saying? He says you're the best combat shooter he's ever met. And he's worked with legends." Tessa shrugged. "He exaggerates." "No, he doesn't. Nolan Pierce doesn't exaggerate." He leaned forward. "So I'm asking again, who are you really? Because the paperwork version doesn't line up with the reality." She sipped her coffee, weighing how much truth she could give him. He deserved something, even if she couldn't give him much. "I'm someone who was trained for a very specific job," she said carefully. "That job requires certain skills. Shooting happens to be one of them. When those skills are needed, I use them." "And the job itself?" "Classified," she said simply. "But it's not just intel work. It's whatever the mission demands on a particular day." Torres nodded slowly, letting that settle. "Then whoever trained you must be damn good." "The best," she said quietly. "And yeah, they taught me to shoot like that, along with a lot of other things." He let out a breath. "Well, I'm glad you ended up with us today. Whatever your real role is, I'm glad it put you on that convoy." "Me too," she admitted. They finished their coffee without speaking, the silence warm rather than heavy. When Torres finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth, if you ever need backup for the next classified thing you get dragged into, I'd volunteer." "I'll remember that," she said. When he left, Tessa sat alone in the dim room, finishing the last of her coffee as the day replayed itself in her head. The choices, the shots, all the branches of possibility that could have ended differently. She'd made the right calls, and the results proved it. But the weight didn't go away just because she'd been right. Every life she took was necessary, authorized, aligned with the rules of engagement. But necessity didn't erase the fact that she'd ended lives. That truth lingered. This was the part people didn't talk about. The psychological toll, even when the violence was justified. It built up quietly, layering over the years like sediment until you had to figure out how to carry it. Some couldn't. Some cracked under it or walked away entirely. Some froze the next time they needed to pull the trigger. She'd watched that happen to people stronger on paper than she'd ever considered herself. But somehow Tessa was still carrying it, still moving, still able to do the job. But she was still here, still carrying everything that came with the job, still willing to step forward whenever the moment demanded it. Her secure phone buzzed, an encrypted message from a contact listed only as command. The text was short. Well done. Full debrief when you return to main base. Travel orders incoming. She typed a simple acknowledgement, wiped both messages from the device, and let the future unfold on its own timeline. What came next would come next. For now, she needed sleep. Tessa placed the empty coffee cup on the desk, kicked her boots off, and stretched out on the cot fully dressed. Despite the faint ringing in her ears and the adrenaline still slowly bleeding out of her system, sleep found her almost instantly, and her dreams stayed mercifully blank. 3 days later, she boarded a crowded C-130 heading back to the primary installation. The plane was filled with people rotating out of forward positions, and she sat near the rear ramp with her rifle case braced between her knees, watching the jagged terrain pass beneath them from 30,000 feet. From up here, Afghanistan looked deceptively peaceful. Brown ridges folding into valleys, silver threads of rivers cutting through the earth, clusters of small villages around wells and streams. It was easy, from this altitude, to forget how quickly those same valleys could erupt in violence. A young Marine corporal beside her kept sneaking glances at her rifle case until he finally worked up the nerve to ask, "That custom work?" "Yeah," she said. "You a sniper?" "I shoot when shooting needs to be done." He gave an awkward laugh. "That's not much of an explanation." "It's the only one I'm allowed to give. Classified stuff, huh?" "The classy kind," she said, and he burst into a real laugh this time. "I'm Jake," he added. "Just finished my first deployment." "Tessa," she replied. "Not my first." "Any advice for a newbie?" She took the question seriously. He looked barely 19, still at the age where combat felt like a story instead of something that carved years off your soul. He didn't need myths. He needed truth. "Stay humble," she said finally. "The second you think you've figured it all out is the second you make a fatal mistake. Listen to the veterans, take care of your gear and your people, and never rely on luck. Luck runs out." Jake nodded slowly. "Anything else?" "Yeah. Know why you're here? When things get hard, and they will get hard, you need a reason stronger than orders. Something that keeps you anchored." He hesitated. "What's your reason?" Tessa looked out the window at the mountains far below. "Because someone has to be willing to do the hard things so other people don't have to. That's enough for me." The plane began to bank toward the main airbase, ending the conversation as everyone started checking gear and preparing for landing. She tapped her rifle case one more time, then settled back into her seat. The main base dwarfed the forward positions. Concrete buildings instead of tents, better facilities, a strange sense of stability despite the war happening around it. Her travel orders led her to an unmarked building near the intelligence center. After showing ID through multiple checkpoints, she was escorted deep inside to a small conference room. A woman was already waiting, Civilian clothes, military posture, sharp eyes, mid-40s, a face carved into neutrality. Her badge hung backward on purpose, name and position hidden. "Petty Officer Calder," the woman said. "Have a seat." Tessa sat, placing her rifle case carefully on the floor beside her. "I've reviewed the convoy reports," the woman continued. "Your performance was exceptional. Lieutenant Siemdercher Locke praised your actions highly." "I did what had to be done," Tessa replied. "You did far more than the bare minimum," the woman said calmly. "You single-handedly disrupted an ambush that should have annihilated that entire convoy." She opened a folder and skimmed through pages Tessa couldn't see. 15 confirmed kills, some at nearly 400 meters under fire, in shifting wind, with moving targets. That level of precision is rare even for us. "Thank you," Tessa said quietly. "So the issue," the woman went on, her tone tightening, "is that extraordinary performance attracts attention, and attention is something your particular specialty does not benefit from." Tessa had known this conversation was inevitable. The alternative was letting American personnel die. "I'm not faulting you," the woman replied. "You made the correct choice. You saved lives, and that will always be the priority. But now we have SEALs asking who you really are. We have reports circulating that will be seen by people very high up the chain. In short, we have visibility." "What's your recommendation?" Tessa asked. The woman shut the folder. "Your cover as an intelligence analyst remains functional, but anyone who survived that ambush is going to question it, so we're pulling you back to the States for reassignment. You'll keep your official role, but we'll be more selective about when and where we deploy you for special tasks." "When do I leave?" "Transport is already arranged. Wheels up tomorrow morning." She studied Tessa's face for any hint of reaction, and found none. "You're handling this better than most," she observed. "I always knew this posting was temporary," Tessa replied. "Most operators dislike being pulled from a combat zone. You almost sound relieved." Tessa thought for a moment. "Not relieved about leaving, satisfied that I did what needed to be done. And whatever comes next, comes next." The faintest smile touched the woman's lips. "That mindset will take you far. Maintain it, and you'll have a long career." She stood and extended her hand. "Exceptional work, Petty Officer." They shook. The grip was firm, precise, someone used to control. "One more thing," Tessa said before the woman stepped out. "The Marines who died in that ambush, do their families get the full truth?" The woman paused. "They receive what we're authorized to provide, that their loved ones fell in combat, that they were heroes, that their actions mattered. The exact specifics, however." She lifted a shoulder slightly. "Some details remain classified, even from families, especially from families. Operational security doesn't bend for grief." It wasn't the answer Tessa hoped for, but it was the answer she expected. In this world, truth came with clearances, restrictions, and redactions. Even death had classification levels. The remainder of her time on base passed quickly. She packed her kit, filed her final reports, and said quiet goodbyes to the very small number of people who'd actually known her well enough for farewells. Most of her actual work had been done alone. Missions without witnesses, success measured in whispers and sealed documents. On her last evening, she walked the outer perimeter as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The peaks turned deep purple and molten gold, beautiful in the stark, unforgiving way dangerous places often were. She had spent months here balancing the facade of an analyst with the reality of her classified role, holding together the fiction of who she was on paper while doing the work that actually mattered. It had been draining and necessary and meaningful. And now it was over, at least this chapter of it. Torres found her near the flight line, where crews were prepping helicopters for night missions. "Heard you're wheels up tomorrow." "News travels fast," she said. "Small world out here," he replied. "Even smaller when someone does what you did." He nudged the dirt with his boot. "We're going to miss having you around. Felt safer knowing you were watching our backs." "You'll manage," Tessa said. "Pierce is a solid chief. Locke knows what he's doing, and you've got good people." "We did," Torres answered quietly. "Then we lost 3 of them because we walked straight into an ambush." His voice carried that heavy, familiar survivor's guilt. "If you hadn't been there." "But I was there," she said. "That's what matters." "Is it?" he shot back, meeting her eyes. 3 families are about to get those visits no one wants. 3 sets of parents, spouses, or kids are about to have their lives shattered. And the only reason there aren't more is because you volunteered for a convoy you didn't even officially belong on. She understood what he was really asking. "You're looking for some bigger reason," she said softly. "Some explanation for why things play out the way they do. But there isn't one. It's just people making choices and living with what comes next. I chose to volunteer. You made choices during the fight. The enemy chose where to place their guns. All those decisions collided. That's all it ever is. Decisions and consequences." "That's a cold way to see it," Torres murmured. "It's the only way to stay functional," she replied. "Start looking for cosmic meaning in chaos. You lose your footing fast." He took a moment to absorb that. Then he said, "The beer offer still stands. Someday, when all the classified stuff stops being classified, I want the real story. I'll hold you to it." He extended his hand, and she shook it firmly. "Stay safe, Calder. Whatever comes next." "You too, Torres. Keep your head down and your powder dry." He chuckled at the old phrase, then headed back toward the barracks. Tessa watched him go, then turned back to the flight line. The Blackhawks were spinning up now, rotors thundering as they lifted into the night. Somewhere beyond the dark horizon, someone on those birds was flying straight into danger. Maybe their mission would go smoothly. Maybe it wouldn't. That uncertainty was the only predictable rule in this world. Tomorrow she'd be on a transport back to the States, back to briefing rooms, classified meetings, training ranges, and the strange double life of someone whose official job barely resembled what she actually did. Back to waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next moment when her particular skill set would turn the tide between mission success and catastrophe. But tonight she was still here, still watching over a base full of people she'd fought beside, still carrying the weight of the lives she'd saved, and the lives she'd taken to save them. She watched as the last helicopter vanished into the night, then turned toward her quarters. She still had packing to finish, logs to update, a rifle to clean one final time before the long flight home. And beneath it all sat the quiet certainty that this strange, hidden, demanding life was exactly what she'd signed up for. 6 months later, Tessa stood on the firing line at Quantico, observing a class of new scout sniper candidates work through long-range problems. The Virginia morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather, which meant they weren't learning how brutal shooting became when conditions worked against you. Her new official role was advanced marksmanship instructor, a convenient cover that let her train shooters while keeping up the fiction that she was just another skilled operator rather than someone who'd worked in the shadows at levels most people would never see. The students were solid, raw, but solid. They had the discipline, the fundamentals, and the drive. What they lacked was experience, the kind you only earned when people were shooting back. "Calder," a familiar voice called. She turned to see Master Gunnery Sergeant Keller heading toward her, his lined face stretching into a smile. At 53, Master Gunnery Sergeant Keller had forgotten more about marksmanship than most shooters would ever learn. He'd overseen her earliest sniper training and had been the first to recognize that Tessa Calder had a gift most people couldn't define, only witness. "Gunny," she greeted him. "Didn't expect to see you out here." "Heard you were back stateside," he said. "Wanted to see how my top student has adjusted to playing instructor." He watched her class for a moment. "Not a bad group." "They will be when I'm done with them," she replied. "Still the same confident Calder," he chuckled. "Also heard a few interesting rumors about a convoy ambush in Afghanistan. Something about casualties being kept low thanks to some exceptional long-range work from an intel analyst who supposedly isn't trained for combat." Tessa kept her expression flat. "Rumors grow legs." "That's what I figured," Keller said. "But then I made a call to an old friend in SOCOM. He confirmed that something unusual went down, and that the after-action made for fascinating reading for people cleared to see it. I can't comment on classified missions." "I wouldn't expect you to." Keller's tone softened, the smile fading into something deeper. "I just wanted you to know I'm proud of you. Whatever you've actually been doing behind the cover story, you're doing it at a level most shooters can't even comprehend." Coming from Keller, that meant something real. "Thank you, Gunny." "Take care of yourself," he said. "People like you, we don't get many, and the world needs you sharp." He walked off, leaving Tessa with her students and her thoughts. During the next break, a young lance corporal named Hayes stepped forward, eager, wide-eyed, untouched by the wear of combat. "Ma'am?" he began. "Yesterday you talked about reading terrain and how it affects ballistics. The way you described it, it sounded like you can predict drift before you fire. How's that possible?" Tessa weighed the question. The truth was messy. A mix of hard training, ugly experience, and instincts shaped by thousands of rounds under every imaginable condition. "It's pattern recognition," she finally said. "Shoot enough rounds in enough environments, and your brain starts forming a library of how everything interacts. Wind, temperature, humidity, altitude, even the time of day. Every variable pushes a bullet in a predictable way. After a while, you stop calculating and just understand." "How many rounds does it take to build a library like that?" Hayes asked. "More than you want to shoot," she said. "Less than you think you need." He laughed. "That's not very helpful, ma'am." "It's honest," she said. "There's no shortcut. You put in the reps, you track your misses, you keep learning until it clicks. 10,000 rounds for some, 50,000 for others. The only constant is that you can't skip the work." Hayes hesitated. "So, how many did it take you?" Tessa thought of the real answer. Training since she was 14, hundreds of thousands of rounds in every climate and altitude, engagements at distances this kid couldn't imagine with tools he'd never see. But that truth was classified, and more importantly, it wouldn't help him. "I'm still learning," she said instead. "Every range day teaches me something. That's why I keep doing it. There's always more to master." Hayes nodded and jogged back to the line. Watching him go, Tessa felt the familiar pull of her double existence. Half her life was spent teaching standard doctrine to Marines who'd use it in predictable ways. The other half was spent preparing for missions she couldn't acknowledge, training with equipment that didn't officially exist, operating in the gray space between conventional forces and people who lived in shadows. The split identity wore on her, but it was necessary. Her skill set didn't fit neatly inside any normal unit. Sometimes you needed someone who looked ordinary, but could perform far beyond ordinary limits. Her phone buzzed, a secure number she didn't recognize. The message was short. Situation developing. Be ready for immediate deployment. More information to follow. Tessa deleted it instantly and turned back toward her class. Whatever was coming would arrive soon enough. For now, she had a job to finish here, teaching the next generation of snipers how to put rounds exactly where they needed to land. The afternoon sun climbed higher, stretching hard-edged shadows across the firing line. Hayes settled into position, adjusting his optic and checking his wind call with the kind of concentration only new shooters possessed. Tessa watched him critically. Solid body alignment, good cheek weld, steady breaths. The kid had potential. "No rush," she called. "Read the mirage. Feel the wind on your skin. Your target isn't going anywhere." Hayes fired. The bullet struck 2 inches low and 1 inch left of center. "Good shot," she said, surprising him. "Now tell me why it landed there." I'm not sure. Thought I had the wind right." "You did. But what about temperature?" she asked. "That target's been baking in the sun for hours. The air above it is hotter than the air around it. What does that do to your bullet?" Understanding lit his face. "Thermal lift. The hot air pushes the round upward." "Exactly. Now adjust and take another." The second shot hit dead center. Tessa allowed herself a small smile. This part of the work felt clean, passing on skill, sharpening young shooters, helping them avoid mistakes that could cost lives later. No classified missions. No cover identities. Just the craft. Pure and simple. But even as she coached her students, part of her mind ran ahead toward whatever mission the encrypted message hinted at. Somewhere, a problem was forming that required her particular brand of precision. Someone out there would soon need impossible shots made under impossible conditions. Someone would need a shooter who bent reality in ways ordinary operators couldn't. And when the call came, Tessa Calder would be ready, because that was who she was. Not just an instructor, not just an analyst, but a weapon deployed when conventional solutions failed. A quiet professional, a hidden asset, the woman who saved a convoy of 620 SEALs and then slid back into anonymity as if she'd never been there. As the afternoon deepened and the students worked through their drills, she felt the familiar coil of anticipation build in her chest. The next mission was close. The next impossible shot. The next moment where her exact skill set meant the difference between success and disaster. She was ready. She was always ready. That was what separated her from everyone else on this range, and from almost everyone in uniform. She didn't just train for the mission, she lived for the challenge. She needed the pressure, the precision, the quiet validation that came from doing what others couldn't and making it look routine. The sun slid toward the horizon, staining the sky orange and gold. Tessa called an end to training and watched her students gather brass and wipe down their rifles. Tomorrow they'd be back, ready to push themselves a little further. But tomorrow she might not be here. She might be boarding a transport to somewhere that didn't officially exist. preparing for a mission that wouldn't appear in any report, relying on skills she wasn't allowed to acknowledge publicly. The duality was exhausting and intoxicating. Because Tessa Calder knew something most people never learned. She knew exactly who she was and exactly what she could do. And that certainty, that clarity of purpose, was worth more than any medal or commendation. She was a weapon, a precisely calibrated instrument, built for a specific kind of problem. And somewhere out there, someone was about to need exactly what she could deliver. As the range emptied and the last students disappeared toward the barracks, Tessa lingered. The sky dimmed. Her rifle case rested at her feet. And her thoughts were already drifting toward the mission she knew was coming. Ready, always ready. It was the only way to live. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to hear more powerful stories of brave women in uniform.